Get our recording started for our online webcast. There we go. So if you would like to watch us on the web as well, you can go to lansingonlinenews.com, and the shows are also archived there. Bill, I saw you yesterday at the Greater, oh boy, here I'll get the name wrong again.
Like I
Historical
do.
Society of Greater
Historical,
Lansing.
right. We had our Lansing Eats exhibit open yesterday, and then the day before we had a program with one of the, probably the dean of Lansing restaurateurs, Angie Vlahakis, who used to own Jim's Tiffany Lounge.
What did you learn about that? What did he have to
Oh,
say?
well, one of the things, one of the great stories he told had nothing to do with the restaurant, but it had to do with how his father met his mother in a very strict time where they had, they had to be escorted, and how he met his wife, and they were just really touching stories.
Oh, cool.
They're Greek, both the family members are Greek, of course. But the restaurant business, one of the things I think people were fascinated by is people came to America with $500, stopped in Chicago, bought a sign for something called the Boston Cafe, and decided they could open a restaurant in Lansing.
Oh,
Yeah, and changed the name later, much later, like 3 years.
the
To
Boston
Lansing
Cafe. I see.
I'd never heard that, so it's pretty
Mm,
interesting. But the first thing they buy is a sign.
interesting.
I mean,
So
when
ethnic food, was his food particularly ethnic?
well, when he for the first 50 years, no, they had
Uh-huh.
nothing on the menu because they didn't think anybody would eat Greek food. And he
Ah.
told a story about how Walter Adams, who's the former president of MSU and a faculty member there, a distinguished faculty member, uh, talked him into having a Zorba night where he could actually serve Greek food. And then they started to make the switch very quickly.
Ah.
People had not been introduced to Greek food very much.
Was there Greek town in Detroit by that time?
Oh yeah, that's been there for.
So they hadn't realized there was, but didn't think there was a market for it in a
Nope,
smaller
did not
town.
think it was for there was a market for it.
Huh. What does he think of the changes in the restaurant business in the years since?
Well, he was careful, but he doesn't think the restaurants certainly are as classy anymore. People
No.
don't dress up when they go out. The servers nowadays they'll come up to your table and say, "How you doing, guys?"
Mhm.
Said no one that worked in his place ever did that.
Mhm.
There was a certain decorum you followed, and you treated them as real customers, and they never
Which I
said.
never liked.
Well, no, but I mean, I mean, having.
I always thought it was pretentious in a small town.
Well, I think you can be careful in how you do it, and that was what he was about. Because
Ah,
I ate there quite a bit. It was a fun place, but they were also polite.
yeah.
They didn't. You still working on that?
Mm.
Working on that. It's
I remember that when I first came here, I joined the Michigan Press Association, and I went to one of their meetings at the Jim's Tiffany Lounge. They met one of the gentlemen there was interviewing the governor, who was Milliken at the time. And when the reporter crossed his legs, he had a hole in the bottom of his shoe, and I thought that's sort of the perfect metaphor for journalism. You know, the only real perk of the job is you might get to ask a few interesting questions to somebody who has some actual power, but chances are you're not going to be the one who has much, unfortunately. So it's kind
and
of
nowadays, I think as we all know, you get to ask fewer of those questions to people in power.
you don't get them.
There's no
You don't
access.
get access.
There's no access.
Which maybe is a segue into our discussion this evening. We're going to be looking at some of the issues related to disparities in power and some of the problems with inequality and how maybe we can start using the vote to address some of these issues. Todd Heywood of the American Independent News Network is with us, and he did significant reporting on the oil spill, the Enbridge oil spill down in Battle Creek, and he was the person who broke the news about how undocumented workers were being used for the cleanup there, and worker exploitation is a serious issue. We're also joined by Dr. Ruben Martinez of the Julian Samora Research Institute at Michigan State University, and they look at Hispanic and Latino issues around the country and do research on all of the concerns of those communities, which is particularly of concern nowadays. I wanted to ask you first, Ruben, if you would tell us, what do you think is going to happen with this immigration bill? I don't think we still have 12 million undocumented workers living among us. I think a lot have left because of the economic downturn. Is that right? But we're going to have to come to grips with this someday. Are we going to do it now?
Well, in terms of the numbers, I'm not sure what the numbers are. I don't think anybody really knows. Yeah. But because they've kind of shut down the borders, a lot of them who were already here could not go back.
Oh.
So there hasn't been a whole lot of movement out. What we have seen is a kind of a stabilization in terms of the numbers coming in. That's decreased considerably, but not necessarily because of the kinds of things that have been done, but rather because of economic growth in other parts of the globe. I would say that's more important. In terms of the immigration legislation, it's hard to tell. I think ultimately the Republicans in the House are going to have to do something, but no one's really sure what the final contents of legislative bill
So you
would
think
look
they'll
like.
pass something?
Well, I think they have to address the issue, and I think they will pass something, but no one really knows what that'll be. Because
Anything other than putting alligators in the moat, it seems to me, would be very difficult to get through the sort of teabag caucus.
That's true. That's true. But it's hard to tell because there are political pressures across the country that are being brought to bear. They're not totally, they are somewhat dissociated from reality, but they're not all of them are totally dissociated from reality. So I think there's probably a lot of room for leadership to step up and to try to herd cats, if you will, over there. But I'm not sure how effective that's going to be. If it doesn't happen now, it's likely to happen in the near future.
In terms of providing a path to citizenship, is that going to have to be part of the package?
Well, no one knows what has to be part of the package. Certainly, that's what a lot of them, the majority of Americans support that.
Mm-hmm.
I was just listening to a segment in which Bill Clinton was talking about how back in the 60s when we were passing civil rights legislation and so forth, that the political leadership tended to be united on these issues,
Yeah, they
and the
did.
people were somewhat divided. And now how we have kind of the opposite situation. People tend to be generally united in the direction where we should go, but the political leadership can't find its way to work together because they've really lost sight of what they're supposed to be doing. So what'll be contained in the legislation, it's unclear. Certainly the people want legalization. They want to have families reunited. They have a kind of a humane sense and sensibility about what should happen. It's really the political leadership that is out of touch with the American population, with the American citizenry, and I think it's just on pure ideology.
Well, one of the stranger things now, of course, is that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and all the business groups would like to see this resolved as quickly as possible because they certainly don't want to be in a situation where they'll either be dinged for large fines if they're using people who are undocumented. They're putting a lot of pressure on this Congress to come up with a solution. But I guess I was surprised at how onerous the process of becoming a citizen would be even under the Senate bill. I mean, it seems to me like that's almost such a huge burden, years of being able to, and you have to identify yourself in the meanwhile, and supposedly you won't be targeted, but I'm not so sure I would trust that if I were somebody who was here under tenuous circumstances.
Well, certainly, the DACA recipients already understand that, right? Because
The DREAM Act.
the DREAM Act, they were able to apply under the executive authority. And then the Republicans have tried to pass bills that say that they can be deported.
Yeah.
So, if you come out of the shadows and you tell them who you are and so forth, there's no guarantee that they're going to respect the law. They like to say that this is a nation of laws,
Yes.
but it's a nation of laws when it's to your convenience, is what it's all about. But to make sense of what's going on across the country, I think it's important to analytically distinguish between two very powerful movements that have been playing out over the last 4 decades, or probably a little bit longer. One of them is what is known as neoliberalism, which is this what I call a movement of radical free market fundamentalism, which has 2 or 3 legs to it that we can talk about a little bit. And then
Naomi Klein's shock doctrine does a pretty good job of laying out the argument.
And then what I call the neoconservatism.
Yeah.
Movement. People think that they're the same, but they're really not. So I like to distinguish the neoconservatives as really the cultural reactionaries, the ones that are anti-everything, right? Anti-abortion, anti-affirmative action, anti-civil rights, anti-immigration, you name it, anti-women.
They're pro-gun, though, I think.
That's because they want to shoot everybody.
I knew there was a reason.
Well, I don't know if they're pro-gun or if they are anti-pro-gun control.
Exactly.
Anti-gun control.
That's a good point. That's a
Yeah,
really
you're
good
right.
point.
I think that's true.
It, yeah.
But and there's overlap between the two.
Oh, yeah.
But certainly when we talk about the chambers of commerce, when we talk about corporations, I mean, these are neoliberals pure and pure.
Right.
Right? They've been liberalizing markets globally. They want access to cheap labor, and so they want the flow of cheap labor
Right.
across boundaries. Right? Part of the problem that they've gotten themselves into is that they have mobilized the negative sentiments that you find in the neocons to try to get people in office so that they can then go ahead and pass legislation that deregulates the economy and so forth. Failing to recognize that some of these people, who once they get in there, are going to then peddle their own agenda. They're going to
Yes.
push the anti-whatever, and to some extent that's gone over the Ruben, so to speak. And we saw that with all the crazy anti-abortion stuff this last year, and the neoliberals really trying to pull away from them and
Yes.
saying, okay, we don't want to be part of that. So it's the way these two play out with each other.
There was an elite consensus on issues like the death penalty. They would let the right play to their base and talk about how, we have to kill everybody that breaks the law. If you're found spitting on the sidewalk, that's capital offense. But when it really came down to it, the law didn't change much. But then all of a sudden it did. I mean, what these groups have decided to do is really start agitating the cultural conservatives, agitating that, no, you're going to have to deliver on that. And so I think that's really causing them a lot of grief right now.
Well, gerrymandering is actually working against it.
Well, that's true too.
They've created districts that they hope would play to their hand, and when you don't serve their needs, they won't play.
Well,
to
they're
your hand.
Republican districts regardless.
Yep.
But you have to get the nomination
But
in
it's
the
the
primary
candidate,
from
yeah,
the Tea Party.
Yep, the candidate.
And so the Tea Party agenda is the one that prevails then. And that's got to be a jolt.
Well, and I think, as somebody who's watched and reported on the LGBT community for almost, good goodness, it's almost 30 years. That's been too long.
Since you were two.
Yeah, exactly, since I was a baby. But the reality is I think that a lot of this we saw in the way the Republican Party addressed the LGBT community and attacked us over and over and over again. And I think they found successful networks to connect with business and the religious community. And now we see the business community, they filed an amicus brief in support of same-sex marriage at the Supreme Court, but the religious conservatives are like, no, 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 no. So I think we're seeing those devil details playing out in multiple levels.
It was a great
regardless
wedge
of
issue for a
minority.
while.
Yeah. Well, and I think immigration is a great wedge issue. Although, ironically, some of the leaders of that movement are now starting to fall down. Look at Chris Simcox from Minutemen, who was just arrested on allegations of child molestation. Those types of things I think are going to continue to play out. But I think the other thing that we see is a destruction of, or an attempt to destroy progressive caucuses and coalitions that are being built. And I think if you look at just the history of this immigration bill just today, just in this context, the LGBT community and international couples were cut out of it.
Right. They were just scapegoated out of it
Yeah.
recently so that you cannot bring in your partner under the new immigration law because they're still the group that it's okay to discriminate against.
So how does, I guess my question to sort of plant out there is, how does that play into sort of the bigger picture of the neoliberalism and neoconservatism that you put out there? Is this pitting groups against each other?
Well, they've been an uncomfortable coalition, haven't they?
Well, these movements go back to the 50s with the rise of Cold Water, what they called the New Right. And then you had the Civil Rights Movement, and you had the backlash to the Civil Rights Movement. So you had the anti-civil rights movement emerge out of that, right? And then you had the abortion movement gain strength. You had the women's movement gain strength. And so all of these things began to kind of get out on the public scene. And as they did, the reaction was to begin to coalesce. I mean, obviously there was in the 70s you had what we called the Christian right, which was all about the moral majority. They were morally right, right? No pun intended. And so you had that happening, and then you had the anti-communism thing going, and then all of these things playing out. And the result of it was that when communism sort of faded away, at least for most of us, then they began to coalesce on these sort of wedge issues, as you call them,
Yeah.
and they've been playing out over the last, 3 or 4 decades. But what it is that they figured out that people are more willing to step up when you promote kind of an anti-agenda than if you promote a pro-agenda for something. So the right has somehow been able to manipulate the public consciousness and the public opinion by doing these kinds of things. And of course, they've lost complete integrity when it comes with playing with the facts.
Right,
I mean,
which
there
is
used
quite
to-
amazing.
There used to be a time when if you were a public person
Yeah,
and you lied, you were held accountable for it,
Right.
And today, I mean, you have the Sarah Palins and everybody else just getting out there and just flat out lying, and the media doesn't even call them out on it anymore. So in a way, we've created an environment in which you can play to somebody's sentiments in an unabashed kind of way and get away with it publicly. And so if you want to be anti-gay, you can lie about whatever.
you have all sorts of
That
phony
population,
studies, yes,
right.
and you can say so.
If you want to criminalize the undocumented, you can do it
Yeah.
and say anything that you want. If you
They're
want,
responsible for all the murders. Haven't you heard?
And rapes.
Right,
And rapes.
and the same thing with abortion and
Yeah.
so forth. So we've created an environment in which there's really no Archimedean point, where no
Yeah.
North Star, where you can sort of
fulcrum.
figure out where the truth lies or where you're headed with it. And I think that scares people. You can play on their fears, and you also what the neoliberals have done is that under Reagan, actually I forget the name of the budget director. Then he was a Michiganian.
David
Stockman.
Stockman?
Stockman.
Yeah.
Who went to prison, by the way.
Right. They had this slogan about starving the beast.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They were anti-government, anti-tax, and so forth.
That was Grover Norquist.
Right. But before, instead of taking the issue head on in a public debate, they decided to come in through the back door, sort of like if you
Yes.
want to control your kids' behavior, you cut off their allowance.
Right.
Right. So if you want to create small government, you don't debate it in public.
No.
You cut off
Revenues.
the funds,
Yeah.
the revenues, and
Cut taxes.
and
That's
cut-
what
cut
Reagan did.
taxes.
You don't
and
care.
that's what this whole
Yeah.
anti-tax movement has been.
Yeah.
Limited government at the same time that you also get to reduce taxes on corporations and the wealthy. So you get sort of two birds with one stone, so to speak.
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Dr. Ruben Martinez of the Julian Samora Research Institute at Michigan State and Todd Heywood of the American Independent News Network. After Bill asks this question, I want to go back to the question on journalists, but go ahead, Bill.
Well, kind of feeds into journalists. One of the things we've seen in the last couple decades, too, is the rise of right-wing journalists.
Fox News.
Well, let's not call them
right-wing radio.
journalists.
Okay.
Let's call them what they are,
Commentators.
which is
Entertainment.
opinionators.
Well, they're
Entertainers.
commentators.
But
Yeah.
I mean, we did. History shows us there were some, like Father Coughlin, but these control networks.
Well, here's what happened. We used to have a multiplicity of newspapers in all of our major cities. You'd have the Independent and the Democrat, the Republican. But for commercial reasons, we're now down to one newspaper. And what they wanted to do was capture all of those audiences so that the commercial dictates of the market really are what created that ethos in journalism that you have to be objective, right? And you can't take a point of view. So you therefore can't call the liar the liar. I mean, they asked Walter Cronkite once back in the 60s when there was a much narrower spectrum of media what he did when somebody lied to his face. And he said, my audience is smart enough that if I ask the same question 6 times, they know there must be something wrong with the answer. Guess what? Audiences aren't that smart anymore. The person just keeps saying the totally incorrect information, and if the audience is a Fox audience, they'll believe it one way. If it's another audience, they'll believe it the other. And unfortunately, the news media no longer plays mediator and says, no, that's wrong. Part of the time, it's because they're ill-prepared. The more we go down to local media, they don't know the issues when they go in. They don't know the right questions to ask. I mean, I've got to ask Todd. Part of what you did when you were covering Enbridge was you went in and you found things others didn't because, first of all, you spent the time. You did your research. You knew what to look for. I mean, that's not necessarily what a lot of news organizations can afford to do anymore.
Well, I mean, I think what I would point out is when I was down there covering the spill in 2010, and by the way, we're coming up on the 3-year anniversary, there's no excuse for me as the out-of-towner to
Yeah.
come in and beat out the Battle Creek Enquirer, which is a Gannett newspaper. And they had 2 reporters working full time on this, and I was scooping them on everything. And as I've gotten away from it and had a chance to sort of evaluate what's going on, what you begin to see is that Enbridge was buying a lot of advertising in the newspaper. Um,
Issuing press releases.
Issuing press releases, which were then just being revamped. There was no accountability being held. And when there was accountability held, I mean, I remember when we broke the story about undocumented workers being exploited on the river, the initial response was to say, this has been reported by an online journalist based in, and they didn't even call me a journalist, they called me a reporter, an online reporter
I thought they called you a
from
blogger.
Lansing. No, they didn't call me, the Enquirer didn't call me a blogger. Others did, but I was just the guy from Lansing.
Yeah.
There was no credit to the name or anything like that.
Yeah.
And once unfortunately the workers were arrested in Texas, and then it became confirmed, well, then suddenly it was reported as fact, and who reported it, who discovered it, and who broke it got dismissed again. And the same thing happened with tar sands oil. We got them to admit that it was tar sands oil, but once it got admitted, then it was just fact, and there was no crediting.
So there's never any attribution back to you breaking the stories.
Correct. So, but if it had been wrong,
yeah,
well, there goes that Todd Heywood from the Michigan Messenger. He screwed it all up again.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's right, and that actually has become my judgment, is when the mainstream media starts picking up my stories but doesn't give me credit for them, I've done a good job.
That's the hallmark of success these days.
That's a pretty sad statement, but yes.
But that's the kind of problem that undocumented workers face, isn't it, Ruben? That they can be put into a dangerous situation with improper gear, no training. Lucky if they get paid. You found out that, I mean, what kind of hours were they working?
They were doing 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week on the river with limited safety protection. They did not have access to bathrooms.
Yeah.
They were forced to consume their McDonald's lunches while covered in oil, and we actually published photos of these men literally drenched in oil eating their lunches, which is incredibly dangerous to their health.
Yeah. You get sick working on it.
I did get sick.
Yeah.
And there are lots of people who are sick down there now as the long-term effects begin to really show up. I have been in contact with some of the undocumented workers recently, and many of them are sick. Many of them are developing liver
What kind of money
issues
did
and
they
that sort of
make?
stuff. They were making about $800 a week plus a hotel room.
Mm.
And it was,
a
of
few
course, paid in
McDonald's lunches.
cash.
Yeah.
You wonder how long the company had this plan in place.
Well,
quite some time.
We actually did some digging and found that this company almost got nailed on the cleanup down in Florida. But in the middle of the night, they swooped in and took all their workers out of Florida so that the feds couldn't nail them there. As a result of our investigation, the owners of that company have actually since been indicted and convicted on multiple counts of immigration fraud and that sort of stuff.
But see, what happened was there were government regulations in place where auto workers, for example, who had been displaced, were retrained for some of these jobs, and it would have been at better wages, and it would have been with the appropriate safety gear, and they would have known what to do.
Yeah, we actually had...
we had people wanting those jobs.
We actually had people from the Michigan laborers who were HAZWOPER certified, which is the certification that you need to do oil spill cleanup, and they would hire them because they were union. Yeah. And yet they would hire this Hallmark company from Texas, which it turns out was bussing in undocumented workers and exploiting them.
I was shocked the other day, Ruben. I've got to ask you about this because I didn't know this was true. That if you hire through a third party with this temp worker idea now, where you're not the person who has any obligation anymore, you can't be dinged under the immigration laws for having undocumented workers. Is that right?
Well, you as the person that has a contract with this subcontractor or this contractor are not the person responsible. It's the person who represents those workers who is contracting with you, so they're the ones that are responsible for that.
So this is the way that factory owners and farmers and people who they're hiring through a third party then, so that they don't have to worry about documentation?
Right. The labor broker is the one responsible now. And so this is the way that you kind of get around the situation. But let's get back to those what I would call the three legs of neoliberalism.
Yeah.
One of them is the ideology of radical individualism, and that is everybody take care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Do not become dependent on government or what they call entitlements in a negative way.
Yes.
Right? So everybody's
That
supposed to take care of
terrible
themselves.
47% that's
Right.
sucking from the government teat
Yeah.
somehow.
Even if you have to live in the street,
Right.
take care of yourself. Don't
Yeah.
depend on anybody
It's
else.
that old French phrase about how isn't it nice that both the wealthy and the poor can both sleep under the bridge at night. We have the freedom to do so.
That's right. They're both free to do that. And if they have no bread to eat, let them eat cake.
Yes,
right?
indeed.
So you've got that piece, and then that aligns very well with the limited government part, because the view is we're not going to have government supporting you. Take care of yourself. But it also limited government. Also, the two other pieces of it is deregulation.
Yes.
So you deregulate safety requirements in the workplace, and that's been happening. So if you take OSHA, to put it bluntly, has pretty much all of the enforcement power has been taken out of it.
The teeth are gone.
The teeth are gone, and that's the way to do it. In fact, under Reagan, the approach was, again, coming in through the back door. If you couldn't take the issue on in public, what you did is you simply closed down the unit.
Yes.
In the sense that you didn't hire anybody else, you didn't hire an executive and so forth, and you have people there who can't do anything. And they did that with the Civil Rights Office in agriculture, and it was shut down basically for about 8 years before people even figured out what was going on. So we're talking about farm workers, right?
Yes.
So you shut down that office effectively, and you don't tell anybody about it, you don't fund it, and it's basically hapless, if you will.
It's how Clarence Thomas can come out of the Civil Rights Division.
Exactly right. And then the third piece is what they call flexible labor.
Yes.
Okay,
That's
flexible.
the piece I think that most people are just beginning to get a handle on. Maybe you can
Right.
explain to us
And
how that works.
on the surface, it sounds like a great concept,
Oh, yeah.
right? Because if you think about it, you think, well, maybe I can work from home, or I can do this and I can do that, right? But that's not what they mean
No,
by
no.
it. What they mean by it is, from the point of view of the corporate firm or from the employer, is that they recognize there's going to be economic downturns, business cycles in capitalism. And so what they want is to have the flexibility to address the downturn by being able to hire and fire people at will.
No
Right.
unemployment benefits.
No unemployment benefits, right? Unions are difficult because they're not flexible,
Yeah.
right?
They want
And-
things like safety. Which
Exactly.
Yes.
So you want to get rid of them. And the other thing of it is, they've moved from having, a 40-hour work week, which is pretty much regulated in terms of benefits and so forth. So you move the labor force to temporary labor force. You bring them in for 32 hours a week or whatever. You don't have to pay them benefits, this, that, and the other thing. So it's really about having maximum economic freedom to optimize profits, cut as much as you can the cost of production, and have government back you up. Right?
Yes, yes.
They don't want government for the people.
No.
They want government for corporations. And so
That's the only person who counts anymore.
That's
Now, as
right,
my good
that's
friend
right.
Mr. Mitt Romney said, corporations are people too.
Yes, indeed.
Corporations
Yeah,
are people.
Yes. And that is part of that whole philosophy, and certainly they are the ones with the deepest pockets when it comes to any government that you can buy.
And the sad thing of it is that, they tried it again just recently with the Ag Bill, right?
Yes.
They tried to cut supports for the poor people.
Food stamps.
Right. Why? Because they don't want them dependent on government. But
It's
this-
bad for them, Ruben.
It's bad for them.
Yeah.
Right. It's not good for them to
To
have
eat.
healthy food. Right.
Especially their kids. Yeah.
But interestingly enough, we really haven't turned the tables on them, so that the one thing that we do know about the corporate class and the wealthy is that they think that they're entitled to a publicly funded military that supports their interests across the globe, and they use it anytime they want to protect their interests and to promote their interests abroad under the guise of national security,
Yes.
right?
And we're number one.
And we're number one, right? We, the people, are being protected by them, and we get all the benefits of sending our children to go fight and die on their behalf.
Yes.
And we don't call that an entitlement.
How'd that work out in Iraq? Oh, wait, it didn't.
Yeah. I was fascinated to see the other day that the new research shows that there are actually higher levels of civilian casualties from drone strikes than there are from civilian aircraft, I mean, from military aircraft. That is a scary statistic. And now what we're doing is we're going to be deploying 30,000 of those drones as part of our domestic police force, just to make sure that we're under the same eagle eye. This is LCC Radio 89.7 WLNZ here in Lansing, Michigan. And Bill, you look like there's something's bothering you there. I can tell.
Everything bothers me.
Everything bothers me.
This is sort of a flashback to the 60s, the military-industrial state.
It is.
It really hasn't changed very much, frankly.
I guess
it went below the surface for a while, but it didn't change.
Well, I was interested today the piece that Daniel Ellsberg had in the Washington Post, where he talked about how the world has changed since the 70s, and that if he were Snowden today, he would do what Snowden did, which was to get out of here, because there was a sense of honor or noblesse oblige among the ruling classes and the elites back in the 70s, where even though they could have continued to prosecute Ellsberg, they dropped the case because they felt it just wasn't worth it. It looked too unseemly. There was that kind of collusion among the elites to at least keep hands off and somewhat play the game fair. Is the idea. That's how someone like a mafia chieftain could get off 2 or 3 times, because the idea was, well, you still play the game fair. Now it's naked power, and it's
well, exactly, and that's where it has indeed changed.
Yeah.
Because from the struggles of the 30s and the 40s, particularly the class war that was taking place then, I mean, the result was a compact between labor and capital, and that was that they would share in the profits of capitalism, even if capital got the lion's share of it. But
sweetheart deals for capital,
right.
But at least the unions got something.
The unions got something, the workers got something, and there was a greater sense of living up to the Constitution, that is providing for the common welfare.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. Under the ideology of some of these sort of right-wing anarchistic economists of the 50s and 60s, we've gone to this naked class war.
Right.
And that's exactly where we're at now. The interesting thing of it is that the center has not been able to articulate what's been happening in a way that will help, because the media is not doing it, but in a way that will help the citizenry understand what's taking place.
But you know what's happening, Ruben, that's kind of fascinating? I mean, I figure the first volley in that war was the Patco strike. And it was when Reagan broke that union. And that was the first indicator that if you really put in somebody who believed in right-wing ideology and was funded by that group, they would go ahead and try to impose that agenda. The compact was over. It was not going to be, play nice anymore and share some of the wealth. But what we're seeing is that if you jam up the levers of power so much that only the elite can wield them, then you see Turkey explode, you see Brazil explode, you see the Middle East. People are taking to the streets around the globe because there is a growing sense that that people are going to have to wrest power somehow, that they can't just leave it to the elites anymore because that deal is broken.
Right, and I think that they also have enough vision to understand that when the safety net shreds is broken through and everybody falls down to the lowest level of human existence, that the conditions will lead to insurrection. And that's why they are consolidating military power and using it and unfolding it in terms of the drones and the walls and everything, because ultimately they know that's going to happen. That's why they're undermining democracy, right? The principles of democracy, because they don't care about democracy. It's a plutocracy. It's a corporate oligarchy. Those are not, forms of power that have to do with democracy. Democracy is but a sham under those kinds of structures, and it's really about positioning yourself to be able to have influence on the global level, control the people in the homeland, and be able to cater to the rising middle and upper classes in other nations.
I'm concerned about the growing rise of the police state here, too. I mean, there was quite a conversation over the weekend on Facebook precipitated by some videos that I put up that were fairly blatant examples of police overreach and abuse of power. There's still a number of people out there, though, who, they had to have been doing something wrong. It's only 1 or 2 bad apples. All of those things that marginalize or minimize the reality that what we've really seen is an incredible growth in the police state in the last 3 decades, especially using 9/11 as a lever. The fear that people had, and quite honestly, I was part of the a consulting group down in Washington at the time working with a police corps. And there was quite a fear that, boy, I mean, they could have literally brought this country to its knees if they had had a succession of different dramatic events in a bunch of Midwestern and Western cities. They literally could have destroyed this economy. And some of the elites got a taste of what that would have been like, and they really did impose some controls. But a lot of the population will trade that safety. They think they're trading their safety, but they're trading their freedom to be able to make a living along with it. I don't think they're realizing that. I mean, where are these jobs going to come from? Technology is taking as many of these jobs away as exporting manufacturing elsewhere.
Well, have you noticed that whenever our candidates for office talk about some of these issues, they always talk about, they're going to get us more jobs, but they never tell us how.
They never do,
Right?
do
Have
they?
they ever told us how? Because I'm always waiting right to hear. Then I think about it in terms of the logic of capitalism and the cost of production, right? If you are going to be able to get undocumented workers and you can pay them X amount of dollars, and you don't have to put up with American workers who want to be unionized, who have some sensibility about their rights in the workplace and so forth. You don't have to put up with that. Where are you going to go?
Yeah.
Right? The logic dictates that you will go to the cheap labor.
Yeah.
And that's the way that it works. Unfortunately, the American people have not woken up to what's
They
going
haven't
on.
caught on
I
quite,
think
yeah.
to some extent the Occupy movement had the potential to do that.
Me
and I think
too.
it did great stuff.
Yeah.
But the police state stepped in. I mean, you
Yes.
even saw this. I'm still thinking about this young lady who was at one of the California campuses, and this one officer
Campus
went
cop.
and pepper sprayed her, and she's just
Yeah.
exercising her
Sitting there.
constitutional right.
Quietly, yes,
Well, and
obeying the law.
I think I sort of look back on the oil spill scenario and the constitutional issues and the impacts. And there are people down there today who are absolutely convinced, even though Enbridge has come in and bought out their houses because they're in a toxin zone, that nothing was wrong, that it was okay.
Yeah,
But I reported multiple times about how the police would interfere with us reporting from a public street about
Right.
what was happening down
Right.
there. And we were the only news outlet that would post up the video of a cop saying, "You can't stand here on a public street taking video of a polluted river." And I'd be like, "The hell I can't.
right.
Please show me the order." I was the only one who challenged police orders that said, you can't have any contact with the river. After the period of days, I think it was 28 days of the governor's state of emergency declaration, unless that was renewed by the legislature, that order no longer stood.
Right.
They had to go to court to get an order for that. They didn't do it, and yet they were arresting activists for going down to the river to take video of them covering up the oil instead of cleaning it up. So as I sort of look at this on a sort of a 3-year basis, I start going, yeah, I can see how the corporatocracy is paying this out. And we even saw it as Enbridge is expanding its line, this line that ruptured. They're paying off-duty sheriff's officers to
Right.
wear their uniforms
Right.
to guard the work.
Yeah.
There is such a blurring now of the line between corporate and the government that it's hard sometimes to tell where the line is.
See, that's where I think I'll make the pitch for history. We just have to go back to the miners' strikes.
Right.
How about the 1913 massacre? Yep. I mean, all that.
Made one.
Yeah, we're there again. We're not that far away from strange things like that going on. They already are going on.
Well, I think that people are afraid, though. I think that there's enough sense of comfort right now
Absolutely.
that to stand up and do that is just terrifying.
I view this society right now as being sort of Wile E. Coyote. They've gone off the cliff. The little legs are going around, and you're safe until you look down, and nobody wants to look down. If you look down, you find out there really aren't going to be that many good jobs in the future. How your kids will compete for those jobs is primarily a function nowadays of an extremely expensive education. And if you can't provide it for them, then you're going to have to do everything that you can, and they're going to be in a hock up to the eyeballs forever, still trying to compete for a dwindling number of good jobs. We have seen that the latest statistics that came out on unemployment last week were widely touted as being great news, other than the fact that the vast majority of the jobs created were part-time jobs, or exactly those flex temp jobs that we're talking about. That's where the economy is headed. I mean, like it or not, lefty though I may be, I'm not a big fan of Obamacare because I don't see it. It is not single payer. It won't be a solution. I can understand how companies are going to start jettisoning people and saying, now, guess what? Go get it where you can get it because we're not going to pay for it anymore. We have enough competition now. We can get a lot of good people. They're waiting in line.
Well, I think the Affordable Care Act is in many ways probably an example
Yeah.
of what may happen with immigration. In other words, that was a compromise. I mean, it started out with good intentions,
Yeah.
right? But in terms of the way that the political players
Reality.
lined up,
Yeah.
I mean, they're the ones that are basically, the right wing basically forced Obama to accept
Yes.
what we call Obamacare, right? And I think to some extent, that's the way it's lining up on the immigration issue. The only good thing about the situation today is that some of the things that you mentioned, that people are seeing that things are not going well in other societies, that people are standing up. And even in Egypt, for example, where the military has now stood up twice in recent times and given power back to the people. Right, I don't know if it's going to happen this time, but I mean, our own military and police powers in our society need to begin to think about what their role is going to be into the future, because this is the direction that we're headed, and I think it's very, very important for people to think about where we're headed and what's going to happen.
Do you think the military in this country would side with us? The Occupy movement out on the street? Boy,
Well,
I'd be really hard pressed to believe they'd say, let's get rid of the current administration if enough of you take to the streets.
well, you got to remember, if you get 13, 15 million people out in the streets, those are very severe conditions,
True.
right? And when you say people have sort of gone off the cliff and they're kind of spinning their legs there in the midair.
Just before the plunge.
I think partly that's true, but we got to remember that the boomers, and I think to some extent their children, had the greatest inheritance
Yes.
of wealth
Yes.
ever in the history of this nation. That's
History of the
what's
world.
keeping them up right now.
It's the prop. Yes.
Right, that's the prop. But that's not going to.
I'm still living off what my dad made in the shops. I'll tell you that much.
Okay, so you're one of.
I am one of them. I paid off my
beneficiaries of
house
that.
with,
Right.
with the
Yeah.
few grand that I got out of my dad's estate.
Sure, and that's, I think, what's propping a lot of people up.
Yes.
But that's not going to last for another generation.
Those wheels are slowing.
Right, exactly. So ultimately, there's going to if the political leaders today do not get it, do not recognize that particularly the Republican Party, that they've alienated women, they've alienated Latinos, they've alienated African Americans, they've alienated Asians, and they've alienated many working white members of society.
Yep.
That the tide may, the pendulum may be swinging in the other direction, except that the structures of power have been transformed so much over the last 40 years that it'll take a long time to really undo them. And I think to some extent that's what people don't understand about Obama's presidency, is that he stepped into a tsunami of political change, and you can't turn that tsunami around. It takes the people to turn it around, and they're simply not standing up.
Well, Bill and I hit the streets back in that first April tax protest before they even had the name Tea Party, and went down there to the Capitol and chatted with the people that showed up after the economic collapse. And I guess the part that kind of angered me was that why did they get there first? The left should have been there first. The left should have been the one demanding the re-regulation of the banks and all of the things that were on their agenda. But into that vacuum where the left has been relatively impotent in this country, the right swooped in and came up with this strange list of requirements, which was basically free the corporations to give us jobs, don't re-regulate the banks, get government off our back, all of the things that really got us into trouble in the first place. And it's as if we seem to be incapable of learning those lessons, and there's nobody there to teach us.
Well, I look back to the time that Reagan came to power. If you think about individuals and when they become politically astute,
Yes.
right?
Awakening occurs,
of political perspectives. It's usually when they're about college age, right? 20, 21, unless they're part of a really oppressed group that they've always known that something's happening. So people who came, who were, 16, 17, when Reagan came to power in 1980, were born in the mid-60s, right?
Oh, yeah.
That means that when they came of age politically, they have heard nothing but anti-government rhetoric.
Yes.
They have heard nothing but anti-tax rhetoric.
Yeah.
And so we now have people who are in their early 50s and everyone younger than that, for whom anti-government sentiments are part of their reality, right? And you hear it, and I'm really concerned that people have this anti-government perspective because government is the great equalizer in society. Government is the great protector of our civil rights. It's the great protector of our human rights. I am not anti-government in the least bit. I am pro-government. What I want is good government.
Yes.
And what I want is bad people out of government, right? Because we can
Don't turn it over to the people who think it's a bad thing.
That's right. Don't turn government over to the people who think government is bad,
Yeah.
because they're there to use it for their own sake.
Yeah.
They've lost their way of what a good society is all about. And so I always like to talk about government is good. It is the market that produces inequality. So why would we turn over our society to a market?
Yeah.
Because it produces inequality. And today we have, as the proportion of people who are poor is as great as when we had the Great Depression.
Yes.
Right? And the market is doing that.
Right.
So I think people need to really understand, government is not bad. It's the people who run it who are bad, and they're the ones we have to replace.
This
So
is
how did we-
LCC. This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan.
So how did we become such sheep?
Well, it's the right that calls us sheeple. You see, the problem
mean,
is
they're
their
right.
messaging is better than ours.
But they're right. We're sheep.
I would like to lay a lot of this blame at the foot of the left's refusal to go for the kind of messaging that a Frank Luntz does. When Frank Luntz came in and persuaded the right that it wasn't the estate tax, which everybody hates estates, why would you want rich people? It's the death tax and nobody likes death. He changed gambling to gaming. Hey, games are fun, gambling bad, he learned how to do this, and the left is one of the problems with being a lefty is that you're aware of ambiguity, you're happy in the gray, you don't want simplistic messages, but guess what? Simplistic messages often work. And part of the challenge in effecting the kind of social change we're talking about, galvanizing large groups of people, is getting a message that they can get behind. I was so pleased to see that the word occupy worked. Kali Lassen, that was his, out of Adbusters in Canada. I'm a sucker for that magazine. I love it. Comes in, I see that, September, something big coming, and it just says occupy. It's got this ballerina on top of a Merrill Lynch bull, and I have no clue what this
illegal.
means. Right, yeah, appropriated the image and didn't care, but they're Canadian.
They walled it off. No,
Yes.
Not walled, but fenced it off.
Yes. But that was such a brilliant meme, and young people got it. Older people looked at that picture and went, what? Ballerina on a bull? What's going on?
Oh?
But it did. It galvanized people. So we have to figure out what pulls the levers of young people and makes them feel that they can take this back.
Funny, and what Ruben has been saying about where there was this time where things changed dramatically. When I worked for government, first came into government under Milliken for a few years when he was still there, and then through Blanchard, it was a good place to work. You felt good about what you did because you were helping
accomplishing
people.
things.
And there were incredibly talented people in government who could have been anything, and some of them ended up being some pretty good places. But when John Engler came in and he demonized government workers, that was a big change in this state.
Yeah.
And no one stood up, including the unions.
Well, and that's what led to this passage of right to work or freedom to work, whatever you want to call it these days. It's right to work for less. But that really began our decline into the passage of that legislation. I think one of the things that sort of just went off me, I think sitting here I'm the youngest person, which is kind of frightening actually. But
and you're old. Oh,
exactly, I am old. But the question I have is, in terms of this, is what role did sort of the shattering of the illusion of Americana from the assassination of ML King, the assassination of Kennedy, and the Watergate scandals and the revelations that came thereafter, what role did those play in allowing the demonization of government.
Well, I don't know. I remember that era. I mean, I was around for that as Bill was, although Bill was hiding out in Canada for a while. But I mean,
Nice place to go if you can.
you can't even go there
You
anymore.
can't go there anymore.
But it was a terrifying era in the sense that there was the sense that the props were coming out.
Mhm.
All of our heroes were being killed. And we watched them die, and we watched them being assassinated on the street, and we watched cities blowing up. And there is, I mean, I'm as much a fan of chaos as probably any good anarchist, but even I was beginning to get a little nervous about where do we go from here. I mean, you don't want to see a bloody revolution because at the other end you often end up with more repression than you did before you started. So how do we get from here to there with democratic processes? I find myself very conflicted looking at Egypt because I know that I'm seeing this through the lens of a lot of American propaganda, and I don't know. All I know is that it looks bad to me when people elect somebody and then the army steps in and says, guess what, that's not good enough. We don't seem to be finding ways to make democracy effective. It's not that I would agree with Morsi's policies at all. I think they're antithetical to women and very unhealthy, and I don't want to see a theocracy, and I don't want to see one vote, one man, one time. But I do want to see that we have structures in place where people have some power. And they don't have to the only alternative is to head to the streets. I'm concerned about voter suppression. I mean, we have 12 million people here who should be voting on their own future, and they can't.
Well, and there's probably a good 80 million out there as well that, at least one party doesn't want them to vote.
Right.
Right. But to get back to the question, when did they start demonizing and how did they do it so effectively? How did they demonize government? I think they really focused on bureaucracy and inefficiency
Yes.
back in the day, and they identified, vulnerable peoples that they could use as a way to
Welfare
mobilize
queens.
negative, welfare cheats
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
all of those vulnerable peoples that
We now have journalists who are getting their marching orders from places like the Mackinac Center, feeding them stories about people eating steak and lobster on food stamps.
right.
They're not doing that on their own shoe leather reporting. This stuff's being fed to them. So it becomes the right-wing agenda think tanks are sending out this kind of information and handing it to the media.
I think we even had a legislator recently in the House who who claimed to have lived X amount of time on, the annual amount that poor
Yes.
people are getting, and said that it was plenty and that he would cut it by a few $100. Actually, I mean,
Yeah.
that's just incredibly.
Because $31 a week goes a long way for
Right.
feeding you. It really not.
So they did that by victimizing the vulnerable and lying to the people. And certainly there were some, bureaucratic problems and some inefficiencies. I mean, they highlighted, the $700 toilet seats that the Department of Defense was buying and this, that, and the other thing. But it was all behind a covert and very strategic agenda.
Those
That's
are the
what was
kinds of
really
messages
good.
that work, aren't they?
Right.
I mean, we've all
Yes.
stood in line to get tags when we forgot to, and you're there for a couple hours and you want to beat your head against a wall and you want to say, I'm paying for this, and that's the kind of thing that they can exploit then. And as long as you make those lines long.
And they've exploited the concept of freedom.
Yeah.
Right. More than anything else, they constantly talk about our freedom, our freedom, our freedom, and we can't, we've got to get government off of us because it's constraining our freedoms and so forth. But what they really mean by that is to have the economic freedom to do whatever you need to do to maximize profits and exploit workers. That's really what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And finally, in this last presidential debate, Romney actually used the words economic freedom. I think that's really what neoliberalism is all about. Full-fledged, complete and total economic freedom to exploit and to optimize profits.
You know where I date it from, though, rather than the assassinations that you talked about? I date it from the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Because to me, when we became the only power, I never thought there was a real upside to the Cold War, but in a lot of ways there was, because it was viewed as there was an alternative. There was at least an alternative debate. And they had to give you enough of the pie in order to keep you from going commie. Once you get rid of the commies, there's no alternative. It's like, nah, then we're going to go for the whole pie.
Well, but they had ideological philosophers to fall back on. Hayek is one of
Yes.
them. Friedman is another one.
Yeah.
Friedman was training well-to-do young men from Chile in the 50s into this ideology of free market fundamentalism and so forth. In fact, they were the ones that went back to Chile after the coup and they toppled Allende. They're
Yes.
the ones that worked with, I forget, Pinochet to rebuild. It was really, that was the neoliberal experiment. So, I mean, they were like literally having experiments with a whole nation
Yes.
economically. And that was happening. And so once they implemented it in Chile, they had, you know, ideas of how to sort of make it happen. And began to play around.
It's like a giant social science experiment.
Bill,
Right.
you read the Wall Street Journal. You saw the editorial that said, we need a Pinochet here.
Yes. Yeah.
And you know, I mean, people have said with a straight face, the Wall Street Journal
Yeah.
suggested that what we really need is a nice dictator who would be willing to torture its own people. I mean, that seemed to me so stunning that nobody is really calling them out on
Their
it.
editorial pages are almost anarchistic.
Oh, they are.
I mean,
Isn't,
they're bizarre.
isn't
That's
the
why they're
right
fun
wing,
to read.
isn't the right wing saying that Obama is that type of dictator?
Of course.
I mean, shouldn't we point that out to them that you know the Wall Street Journal called for it? You got him. His name is Obama. Now get out of his way and let him be a dictator.
So far, he's been doing a good job for them, from what I can see. There are some of us who are not necessarily as thrilled
I'm not
about
particularly
his
as
record.
thrilled about where he's come from either. I mean, I think he's not fulfilled the promise. Although I do think, speaking on that, part of the reason why he was so successful is that he did capture that simple messaging.
Yes, he did.
First campaign.
Change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and even the
Hope.
second campaign.
Yep.
Hope, change, and actually the hope thing I think links back to Clinton, who was also incredibly successful because of the hope. You know, the guy from Hope.
Todd is recently back from Netroots Nation, which is, well, it's always been my contention that they don't do as much good work as they could. Yes, there are a lot of well-meaning people doing good projects, but they really too often just end up shilling for the Democrats regardless
Yes.
of what the Democrats do to you, and that's always a concern. But I would like to think that maybe when Obama talks about the fact that you have to make me do this, that in some ways what it is a sort of covert rallying cry that said, if you really want this to happen, you're going to have to get off your duff and go out to the capitals and show up in the numbers that the Tea Party did. Because without that kind of pressure, I don't have enough political cover to do much. You know, I mean, the way elections are structured, the economic realities of this, I'm hamstrung.
Well, that's the political reality,
Yeah.
and he's telling the people that, right? What Obama did bring was a revolution in cultural values. He restructured the public discourse in ways where we can talk openly about some of these things, and how important it is that people not be dying of starvation, that they have some access to healthcare. He did bring about that the revolution in cultural values, but you know, you can't undo 40, 50 years of
Wow.
restructuring of American power in one or two terms, right? And he is basically telling the people, stand by me and let's move forward together if we're going to bring about change, because the change that has been brought about already is so incredible that, I mean, he basically is hamstrung. I mean, he's,
I agree.
you know,
I
he
think
can't do it.
Yeah, he was the right president at the wrong time
Yeah.
in some ways.
Yeah,
He's-
true.
Or the right president at the right time, because, you know, Clinton was a neoliberal.
Yes, he was.
And we have to say that out in public. And he didn't
He was
raise
Republican light.
exactly.
Yes, he was.
He did not question any of these things. He supported, you know,
Pro-NAFTA.
free market fundamentalism, all of that kind of stuff. So someone had to get up and say these things. And I think, you know, the person who gets up and says it and gets elected is the right person. Whether he can bring about the scope of change that people want. You know, that's part, I think, of the American myth that, you know, you can elect a person and then they have all this control. They don't,
Right.
right? You know, just
As
like-
anybody who's ever tried to run anything.
Clark.
Right, right,
As
exactly.
anybody who's ever been elected to office
Yeah,
knows.
right. Oh. Well, it's going to be quite an interesting future. I think we're at the crux of a major change. you know, we keep doing our little radio show here in the basement of LCC, and nobody's thrown us off the air yet. Who knows? Maybe we'll be
Yet.
back next week. Maybe we won't. We'll just see. At least we got parking while Common Ground was here. I always figure that's a major improvement. I want to thank Dr. Ruben Martinez and Todd Heywood for joining us this evening. This has been Lansing Online News Radio with Bonnie Bucqueroux and Bill Castaneer. We'll be back again next Monday. This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. Thank you very much.
Are we off the air? Still recording.
Yes.